What's up, Mentors Collective? How's everyone doing today? On this episode, we're going to be talking about something that I am highly passionate about, and that's leadership, especially how to gain influence in the market as a thought leader, as a subject matter expert. It seems like everybody on the internet's trying to establish their credibility and expertise in something. But people aren't stupid. We can tell the difference. And in this episode, we're going to talk about what are some of the traits that are common amongst actual influential leaders, and what can you do to attain those traits and be seen as a true leader. And to have this discussion, I brought on a friend, Poirier. I hope I pronounced that right. He's a multiple-time TEDx speaker. He's the host of the top-rated Let's Do Influencing radio show and founder of the fast-growing Blue Talks brand. He's also a best-selling author and co-author of the Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller, Quitless. Corey, welcome to the show. Thank you, brother, for spending some time with me and my audience.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure, Jay. I'm super stoked for this. As I kind of said off air, talking influence and influencers is my jam. So, yeah, I'm super excited to see where this leads, and I'm super excited to be all in.
Same here. And I'm excited to be talking to another host because you usually have really good conversations, usually deliver a lot of value. So everyone who's listening, you're going to get a good one. So Corey, let's start off talking a little bit about how you became kind of an influential leader. Obviously, you've done TED Talks. You can't do a TED Talk unless you have that credibility, unless you have some of those traits that we're going to discuss. At least that's my impression. So I'd love to hear your journey.
Yeah, and I'm happy to share it. And I will tell you where it all kind of started for me, because I think it's a bit different, Jay, than most people. But a number of years ago, I worked in a sales career for about 10 years. And it was a very aggressive sales career. I've had realtors say to me, ask me, what gives you the right to teach me anything? And I said, I don't know if I have the right, but here's what I did for a living. And when I told them, they're like, oh, well, you definitely have done something I've never done, which was sell photocopiers door to door. So for 10 years, I had to go around business to business and convince them that it was time to upgrade this piece of yellow equipment that they never looked at and didn't see any value in. And I had to convince them why they should spend more money on a different yellow piece of equipment. And so I had done that for about 10 years. And what happened that changed everything for me and what led me down this path to TEDx talks and speaking on stages is that this one night, what happened was I had a stage play that I wrote and directed for a festival. And this one night, one of the actors sprained his ankle on the way to the show. He was the lead actor. So I needed to buy him more costume change time. And so I had to write myself into the play that I did not want to be in. And at the end of the play's run, I ended up being there for 4 nights. I was on the stage. I did not want to be there. And I asked one of the actors on the drive home, I said, hey, how do you think I can get more comfortable doing this? And he said, I don't know if this is the answer, but he said, I'm going to a stand-up comedy workshop at the local university. You want to give it a go? And I said, that sounds terrifying. Why not? And my thinking, Jay, was I'll never get on a stage. I'll just go and learn more about writing and see how people get comfortable on stages. So we went to this workshop. We were taught, here's how you adjust the mic stand. And then the guy put on the show, he was a fan of Steve Martin. And so he just played Steve Martin records and said, Steve Martin's awesome. That's all he taught us was how to adjust the mic stand, and Steve Martin's awesome. Week number 3, we went to our club and we put on a comedy show. We were told we were going to watch comics and then we were going to talk about what they did right and wrong. And so long story short, we found out 5 minutes to showtime. We were the comics. And 8 out of the 15 people there walked out the front door. I've never seen them again in my life. 7 stayed. I was one of the foolish 7. And I went up first. I told my first joke ever. And I was the first person that whole night to tell a joke to dead silence. And then I told a second joke and it was dead silence. And maybe a tumbleweed went by the stage. And the guy that got us into this whole thing, calls me over to the corner, gives me a schmuck in the back of the head. And he said, you idiot, what are you doing out there on the stage? We haven't even started the show and turned the mic on yet. And so I was out there telling my jokes, no mic turned on, wondering why nobody's laughing. By the way, people always ask me, what's the finish of that story? We got the mic turned on, told the same jokes, and they died again, meaning they didn't get laughter. And I said, I may be the only comedian in history to tell the same jokes twice in 10 minutes and bomb both times. But I bring all this up because it does go right into how the TEDx thing and everything else started. So that start of that night, I basically bombed horribly. And that's what we talk about in comedy. We call it bombing when you have a horrible night. Since that time, I've performed 700 shows over 9 years. in comedy. Now, I haven't performed any in a bunch of years. The last show I did was Second City, and I did it because it was such an epic moment. Like, that's such an epic, prestigious club. But I bring all this up because what happened was after about, I kept going back week after week. And by the way, horrible. Like, I would be there for 10 minutes, no laughs, and keep going week after week. And then somebody invited me to a Tony Robbins conference, and I was sitting beside them, and they said, "Can you believe he's getting paid money to do this?" And I said, "Hold the farm." It was like a record scratch moment. And I said, "People get paid to do this? And I'm going to a comedy club and working my butt off for drunk people who are heckling me, and I'm getting $10 from the door?" And I want to know more about that. So I approached the local college, convinced them, it took me a year, convinced them to let me teach a sales course. And that's how it all gets started for me. And so basically, I started out as a trainer, pretty quickly evolved into speaking. And by the time I got on my first, let's say, well, if I talk TEDx, my first TEDx stage, I had probably spoken maybe 500 times, and I had probably performed stand-up comedy by then about 300 times. So to your original point, you can get on a TEDx stage and it be your first talk ever. I've seen that once. But it's the most terrifying stage you'll ever get on. So maybe if it's your first talk ever, it's good because ignorance is bliss. You don't know how terrified you should be. But it is, most people I know who've spoken on and gotten paid well to speak on hundreds, if not thousands of stages, have said it's the most terrifying stage you'll ever be on. So it is no joke. And I do think that you should take it seriously, and you should find a way, whatever that means to you, to be ready, because it has the potential to change your entire life and career. What I mean by that is, for example, one of my TEDx talks, it's around 30,000 views now, which now is good for a TEDx. Early on, like every TEDx seemed to go really big views. Yeah. But I'll tell you one thing, when it was only at, I think it was 5,000 we already could track 300 paid speaking engagements. Now I get paid thousands per talk, so you can do the math. 300 plus paid speaking engagements we could track directly to either them finding me through the talk or us using the talk as kind of a sizzle reel for when they wanted to see me speak. And so what I'm getting at there is it's no joke in the sense that if you leverage it properly, it can change everything. And I don't think it should be your first stage ever because you won't be ready for it. And at the same time, I do think it comes with some responsibility because of what it could do for you. There's many TEDx talks out there with 100 views and people didn't take them seriously. But to answer your question, and that was the longest way possible to answer your question, I think, Jay. But to answer your question, yeah, it is something that when you get on that stage, you can leverage that for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I think having a TEDx talk, having a TEDx stamp in your bio and that on your website and your sales material it's one of the modern day ultimate forms of credibility and trust, because that's not easy to do. They vet you and you need to be good. I assume the way that you did it to practice and get on stage doing comedy, and man, 7 out of 15 is not so bad. I would expect like 80% to run away. I would run away with pooping my pants if they asked me to stand up on stage and do comedy. That is crazy. And you got to be bad at something before you're good at something, right? So good on you for getting up on stage, bombing, and continuing to have the career that you've had speaking. That's really incredible. And I work in the PR space. I work with a lot of thought leaders, people who are so-called subject matter experts, and they want to do talks. They want to do TEDx. They don't want to put in the initial work that you put in, doing sales trainings, doing stand-up comedy. And we've booked TEDx for a few people, and some of them did okay, some of them don't. What is your advice to leaders that want to do talks like that maybe don't have the cojones to go do stand-up comedy or spend a whole career as a sales coach? Like what would you tell those people? What would your advice be?
So I'm a person that I would say most people that know me would tell you I'm the last person to sort of pitch somebody on hire me and I'll show you how to do it. So I'm going to speak in general terms. What I would say to that person is, if you don't want to spend the time to learn how to do it, go to somebody who has and learn from them. So in other words, you can either put in the 10,000 hours or find somebody who's put in the 10,000 hours and find out what the most important 100 hours of the 10,000 were and learn that from them. So for instance, we do training for speakers. We help speakers get on stages. Like at this point, the numbers get a little insane because I've spoken roughly 3,000 times. So I've watched probably 10,000 speakers. With our Blue Talks, we've helped hundreds already get on our Blue Talk stages. We coach them to get on stages. So when I say this, I've done a lot of work with speakers. And what I will say is most speakers are coachable. So first of all, I would say be coachable. Be one of the speakers that are coachable. And then secondly, find a good coach. And when I say coach, I'm not talking about a speaking coach. I remember hearing one time, I forget who it was that said it, but I remember hearing it or reading it in a book. The person said, it's kind of strange that there's more good speaking coaches than there are good speakers. You know, the idea that everybody and their dog says they're a great speaking coach. I'm not talking about getting somebody that will teach you how to articulate this perfect way or how to do this or that. I'm talking about finding somebody who's studied the best of the best and ask them what are the 20 things I need to know instead of the 5,000. So I'll give you, for instance, because I got this from my comedy world, it sounds like such a small thing, but one of the big things I think is if you can learn the power of three and use that in everything you do. So Steve Jobs, in his presentations, which are considered some of the best ever, you can literally watch him count out, Jay, three things. So when he's talking, he'll go, it's it's a phone, it's a computer in your pocket, it's an iPod, it's a phone, and that's how he launched the iPhone. You know, so he basically said it's a phone, it's a computer in your pocket, it's an iPod, and he kept doing it, but he kept counting threes. That wasn't an accident. Steve Jobs would spend 6 months getting ready for one talk, and of course, the media would pick it up everywhere because it was such an amazing talk. What I'm getting at is comics know and speakers know there's an importance of the number three. So understanding that kind of stuff, understanding the power of storytelling. And when I say that, I don't mean just storytelling. I mean understanding that there should be a hero in your story and there should be a villain. Most people you don't have to tell the audience what it is. It doesn't have to be super clear, but we need to have somebody or something we can throw rocks at in your story and somebody or something we can cheer. And so what I'm getting at is it's all these little tweaks. Another thing I talk about often is we all hear that content is king. Well, I make the argument that yes, that's true and you need good content, but emotional connection is queen and the queen rules the castle. So what I'm getting at there is you can have brilliant content, but if you're a boring speaker and don't connect with the audience, nobody will care. You can have mediocre content and be a brilliant dynamic speaker and people will want to figure out more about what you know than you actually know. Like they'll put up with it. You talk to anybody who said that's heard a brilliant speaker that's boring and they'll say, oh my God, I couldn't wait for it to end. But yeah, you've heard people say he was okay, but man, I left and I was on fire. So my point is focus on both, but I would say make sure you don't lose the sight of being dynamic, being engaging, being passionate. So I'm rhyming these off quickly, Jay, to say, find somebody that knows these elements if you don't want to spend the time doing that. So you can learn those things that you need to learn and you don't have to go up and down. Somebody told me today, Jack, most people go up and down the beanstalk from Jack and the Beanstalk, but never actually want the happy ending. They never try to find it. They just keep going up and down the beanstalk. So what I'm saying is don't keep trying to go up and down the beanstalk, picking different beans and saying, oh, I need to know this, I need to know that. If you're not willing to put in the time, which is fine, go to somebody who's put in the time and ask them, what are the things I need to know? Not what are the things everybody knows.
Right. That's super helpful.
Is that a fair answer?
Yes, absolutely. And just kind of piggybacking off of that, right? So that's speaking skills. Obviously, when you book an opportunity like that, you want to crush it. You want to make the most of it. You want to be invited to the next engagement. You want to get more views on your TEDx talk. Now let's dive a little bit into influential leadership, because a lot of people, want to do the talk, but it's scary to them. They don't know. They don't think they're enough. They might not be an influential enough leader to stand on stage in front of other experts and spew off their expertise. So tell me, in your own words, what does it take as a leader? What should you have on your resume? What should you have done before you get up and you're ready to actually teach?
So this is a great point because I'm not a believer on faking it till you make it, but I am a believer on if it's authentic. If you can find a way to make it sound as great as possible, as long as it's authentic, then you should leverage the as great as possible. So I'm going to answer this, and I'm also I thought one other thing I want to tell you that I would say to people that are looking for the shortcut when it comes to speaking is one thing I do differently for any of the TEDx talks I've done. I do it for our Blue Talks. I don't do it for any other talk. I'm not a memorized speaker guy. So what I do, though, for those talks is I practice them 50 times. So if you don't want to go, like we said earlier, and spend all the years in comedy and that, practice it on your own in your own room 50 times. And the reason is you need to know the talk so well that if you get thrown off track, you can come back to it no problem. And you can wing it if you need to. So I just wanted to stamp that off and say that that's another thing I would add is be willing to practice a lot of times in a very short amount of time if you're not willing to put in the years of sweat equity. As far as the influencer side of things, I'll come at this a couple of ways. One of the things, like people say to me all the time, how have you done this or how have you done that? And I'm going to go into one word and say, if this was the word I could teach everybody, and I happy accented into it, anything I'm sharing with you, I was stubborn and I had to learn the hard way in the trenches by failing. But what I would say is the power of the word leverage. So when you get one tiny thing, squeeze every bit of juice you can out of that. So what I'm getting at here, I'm going to explain that further. If you, let's say, get to write an article, I'm just going to use an example. But let's say you write an article for, I don't want to say Entrepreneur or Forbes or what have you, because I'm trying to help a person that maybe isn't there yet, meaning they can't land that yet. But maybe you write an article for Influencive or another one like that where it's halfway between. And there, by the way, there's some of those opportunities that are pay to play. I won't go all into that, but you can, invest and then you get to write articles for them regularly. So if something like that, if you get, let's say, Influencive, then what you want to do is, of course, you want to share it once the article comes out. You want to do all the stuff you would do anyway to promote the article. But just as big as that, you want to have on your email signature, check out my new article on Influencive. You want to, and I'm going to talk in a second about as seen on banners. On your as seen on banner, now Influencive should be there. And so what I'm getting at, Jay, what I've done, and it took a long time to figure this out, but I leverage everything. I leverage the first thing to get the second thing, to get the third thing, to get the fourth thing. So I'll give you a real world example that I think could help a lot of people. Is when I started my first podcast 13 years ago. Same podcast is still going. We got lucky because we started real. I mean, that, as you know, that's early on. So we built a pretty good subscriber base from day one. But before we had an episode, I approached Jack Canfield. Now, you probably know who Jack is. Some of the listeners will. He co-created Chicken Soup for the Soul. And so at the time, Jack was doing this many podcasts. So people that can't see my hands, 0 podcasts. It wasn't his thing. So I went to his team. They said, Corey, chances are it's going to be a no. He turns down 9 out of every 10. And so I'm not a believer in no. I said, okay, well, it's a no for now. It's not a no always. So I kept following up for about 4 months. And they said, Corey, pretty sure it's a no by the end of the 4 months. But what I had as an ace in my sleeve is I looked on Jack's website to see who was giving him testimonials. Found a guy named Dan Sullivan, tracked him down, checked his stuff out. Found out he was being interviewed on Success Magazine's, when they used to have the CDs that you listen to in your car. I listened to the interview. He said, this is one of my favorite interviews of all time. My interview style was very similar to Darren Hardy, who ran Success at the time. So I reached out to Dan's team and said, hey, I think Dan would like this interview because it's similar to the one he did for Success Magazine that he loved. So they said, yeah, let's get Dan on the show. Now, one thing I had found out already by this point, Jay, is that how Jack and Dan knew each other is Dan ran a yearly conference once a year. I think it's a $25,000 buy-in. But Jack and Jack's writing partner, Mark Victor Hansen, both attend that conference. So technically, he's Jack's coach. And I'm like, okay, great. So I reached out. We got Dan on the show, did the interview. I dropped Jack's name a few times. Finally, Dan did what I was hoping would happen. And he said, Corey, Jack would love this show. You should get him on the show. And I said, thank you, Dan. And then what I did was I took that clip, I sent it to Jack's team, and I said, even Dan, Jack's coach, thinks Jack should be on our show. And the next morning, they sent an email saying, Corey, Jack's in, send us your calendar. It was almost like they gave up. They submitted. But my point of this, Jay, is I leveraged Dan to get Jack's interview. But here's what I can do now if I'm that person listening on and wanting to become an influencer. Now what I can do is I can go on Jack's website and Dan's website and see who all they've referred or are given quotes to. Because now I can go to them and say, hey, we had Jack and Dan on the show. You'd be a great fit too. Maybe I could go to Jack's writing partner, Mark Victor Hansen, who's now become a friend, but I didn't know at the time. Maybe I can go to him and say, hey, we've had Dan, your coach, and Jack, your former writing partner, on the show. You'd be a great fit too. What I'm getting at is there's a better chance he's going to say yes, because now there's a social proof that people are choosing my show to be on. So leverage is such a huge thing, I would say, for early on. So if you write an article, where can you put that? So squeeze the juice out of it. I said as seen on banners. Here's what I'd recommend right away. You might recommend this to your clients. You might help clients get this. But get those first 10 interviews on podcasts. I don't care if it's a shoe box podcast where somebody's doing it in their basement with one listener. I don't care. Go and do 10 podcast interviews and then tell them you're going to use their logo on your As Seen On banner. And once you're done with those 10 podcasts, I want you to have an As Seen On banner on your website. Because most people don't know how big the podcasts are, but what they do know is when they see that As Seen On banner, they do know you're more credible. Yeah. They go, wow, the media vetted this guy. And I think every single influencer and expert needs to have an As Seen On banner on their website. But the coolest part is people think I have to wait until I'm on Super Soul Sunday to have the banner. No, you can go on the smallest podcast in the world and get that banner built. And by the way, then what you do is you just shift it out. Once you land TEDx, shift one out for that one. Eventually, you'll have TEDx, Entrepreneur, Forbes, what have you. So again, that was a long answer, Dan, but Jay, but I wanted to go. I was going back to when I mentioned Dan. I wanted to at least go into depth about what I would do if I was starting out to start layering that level of influence. So get the first one. Don't wait. Get the first one. Leverage it for the second one. Leverage it for the third one, and just keep knocking down those dominoes.
Awesome point. My friend Omar, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he did the same thing and was able to land people like Tony Robbins, Ed Milet, as a nobody kid with nothing. Built the show out of nowhere, and now he's got A+ listers on the show. But I think what he displayed, the same thing that you told me, was not only leverage but grit. Like, you hustled because you wanted to land Dan on your show. Sometimes to get the big fish that's going to land you the bigger fish, you got to put in the work. I think he said he staked out Ed Milet's house for like 3 days and just like cornered him until he finally said yes. I heard that story and I was like, man, I got to give it to you. Like, as annoying as that must have been for Ed, like, I'm sure not a lot of people have that tenacity to go stand there day after day, figure out where they're eating, just badger them until they say yes. But it worked, man. He's got all the A-listers and he's able to leverage those to get bigger and bigger names, just like you did. Absolutely. So for people listening, if your TEDx says no, don't take no as an answer. Go find some leverage, go get some leverage, and go hustle until you can do it. So that's an awesome story, Corey. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
So one of the other topics I really wanted to dive into was traits of credible leaders. Commonalities that all influential leaders have. You've talked to a lot of them. You mentioned several, that I'm familiar with myself that you've talked to over the years. And how many interviews have you done, you think, Corey?
Okay, this is going to sound crazy, Jay, and people are probably going to say, "How's that even possible?" And I'm happy to actually tell people how it's possible because every one of these are documented. We are approaching 7,000.
7,000 interviews.
Yeah, so it's like Napoleon Hill, if you're familiar with him, Napoleon Hill level. I was obsessed with Napoleon Hill and Think and Grow Rich. I'm obsessed with interviewing people. And just so people don't go, that's crazy, that's not possible. I just to tell one thing about how that happened is I used to have a newspaper for about 8 years, monthly newspaper, and I had to do roughly 100 interviews every month for that paper for 7 to 8 years. So when you crunch those numbers, it's like 4,000 or more were just for that one project. And then, of course, we've had a podcast for 13 years since. So I just want to back up where those came from. But yes, the number is between 6,500 and 7,000.
Man, I've talked to senior Forbes contributors who have been doing entrepreneurial columns for 20 years. And yours, by far, it dwarfs that in terms of how many interviews you've done. So I'm probably talking to the right guy when I ask the question, what do leaders have in common?
So what I'm going to do, and I'll do these really quickly, I'm going to tell you the top 3. Because I think I always like to do that because I feel that if I just say one, it may
Rule
not resonate
of 3,
with
right?
Yeah, exactly. Rule of 3. It's funny when I do talks. If I do a longer talk, I go 5. I mean, it's not like you can never go beyond 3, but I understand that you have to find a way to mix it up because 3 is what people are going to retain. So, but the top 3 in reverse order, because I want to save the best for last, of course. And there's 2 that are kind of very close now. But the third one, and it's actually the one I think can make the biggest difference for most people, in fact, and I'll explain what I mean by that, but I call it the power of no. So here's a kind of little trivia, and this number changes over time as I keep doing interviews. But right now, I figure the average influencer says no at least 20 times more than the average person. And so I want people to really think about what I'm saying there. So most people say yes and figure out how to do it later. Most influencers say no to everything unless it absolutely feels like a yes. And So there's a very distinct difference. Now, the challenge I find with a lot of things with that is most people want to say yes to everybody. And I struggle with that. So what you'll find, you might wonder, well, how can all these influencers say no so often? Some of them have to hire, and maybe they don't even know that the no's happening, but hire a gatekeeper that filters them out. So for instance, there's people I'm still trying to reach, after all these years for an interview, that I'm still dealing with the person that's trying to keep me out. So that person I'm trying to reach has never known I've even inquired once, because they have a system set up to say no. And what it's going to take for that person is I might have to go to the main TED conference or something and be sitting near them or see them at a table. Like, I'm going to have to find a unique way in. But back to that point, so they say no to all the things that don't move the needle to be able to say yes to the few things that do. Now, what's really interesting about this is Chalene Johnson, who's Turbo Jam fame, and she's really crushed it in podcasting as well. I asked her about this, and I'll never forget. I said, but how do you say no? How do you say no without like burning all these bridges? And because I know there's some influencers that just say no, it's a hard no for me. And it's just like, I feel like it hurts the relationship to some degree. What she did, I think, is so powerful, is she said, she'll tell them, look, I have to talk to my husband because we're like a family style business, and make sure we don't have some family plans already. So let me talk to Brett and see if we have anything on the go. If we don't, then I may be able to help you out. If we do have something to go, I'm going to try to find somebody else who can help you. So the thing about that is it gives her time to think about it, whether she really wants to do it. Nobody's going to get mad at you because you say, I have to check with my family. And the other side is she's saying, I'll offer somebody else if I can't do it. But what she found, of course, is that most of the time, by the time she comes back to them, they've already found somebody else anyway. Right. But how can you get mad at somebody who says, I'll see if I can do it, and if I can't, I'll find you somebody who can? So my point of that is, first of all, you have to know what a no is. Second, you got to be bold enough to say it. But third, you got to do it in a way, I think, that still keeps the relationship alive. I'll give one more piece of insight there, and I didn't mean to go this far down this rabbit hole, but I'll give one more piece of insight. People always ask me, how do I know what a no and a yes is? And I have a very clear answer to that. I wrote a number of years ago a mission statement for myself, and it's changed over time, but for the most part, it's still pretty much the same. And what it says is, I'm the guy, or I want to be the guy, or however you want to word it, who donates, motivates, inspires, educates, and entertains. So for me, what I do, Jay, is I say, when somebody says, will you take this on? If it's one of those or zero, it's the easiest no without regret I'll ever say. If it's 4 or 5 of those, it's the easiest yes I'll ever say without regret. And if it's in the middle, those are the only ones I really have to take time to think about. But that mission statement helps me figure out immediately, is this one going to be moving the needle for me or throwing the record in the garbage? And so that's how I decide on a yes or no. So I think a person has to figure out, what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve? And then when somebody asks you to take something on, ask every time, is it going to move it forward or backward? So that's the number 3. Number 2 is I call it lifelong learners or leaders. But really what it is that the top leaders have figured out that just because your schooling is done doesn't mean your education is done. And so there's people like, if you go back to Jack Canfield, I remember interviewing him. He was 69 or 70, and he was still going to Tony Robbins events, taking notes at the back of the room, even though he knows Tony personally and can go back and learn it from Tony directly. And I remember I brought this up in another interview, and somebody said, yeah, I was at an event and I saw Jack taking all kinds of notes, and they told me the story, which I always love the visual. They said, but there was a guy near him that was like 19-ish, and he was looking over Jack, shaking his head, almost like, what, you foolish, crazy guy, what are you doing taking all these notes? And what the guy said in the interview, he said, the funny part to me is I realized that Jack doesn't need those notes anymore, but that 19-year-old needs those notes more than he'll ever know. But the point is, Jack doesn't need the notes, but he understands if I keep taking the notes, it's going to keep reinforcing it. So Zig Ziglar, the late Zig Ziglar, I interviewed him before his passing, and he had already had short-term memory loss. And I said, so, how do you spend your time? And he said, I continually read books that are either true or like biographies and stuff, or things that can help me improve my life. But here's the guy that was 80-some, already lived his whole career, short-term memory loss, and was still educating himself. And what I would argue is, this hasn't changed. This has been a trait that has served influencers well since the beginning of time. And my backup to that is we went to Concord, Massachusetts, where Ralph Waldo Emerson and some of the great writers of the 1800s lived. And we went there and went into Ralph Waldo Emerson's house and discovered almost immediately that his own personal library was bigger than the library down the road for the public. And so I've seen over and over again that the top leaders of yesterday that might have only a grade 3 education, like the Henry Fords, the one thing they all had in common is they all had a personal library in their house. Lifelong learners are leaders. The people that invest in themselves are the ones that rise to the top. The last one is the reason I said the power of no is maybe more powerful, even though the last one's more popular and it's the more common one, is because this one's either an all or nothing. And if you already have it, it's hard to move much forward with it. But basically what I've discovered is the top leaders and influencers, they live on purpose every day. So they've discovered their calling, they've discovered their passion, and I think passion is what you do, purpose is why you're doing it. They've discovered that, they've discovered your why, whatever you want to call it. They've discovered that, and they spend as much time as possible every day living that. So all three of these, what I think is amazing about them, but that last one, like I said, you either have it or you don't. And I mean, I can help somebody try to find it, but it's one of those all or nothings where the power of no, we can all start doing it tomorrow. What I love about all three of these things is you'll probably notice, Jay, is that there's no requirement for your background. Doesn't matter how much money you started with. Doesn't matter how much education you have. Like all of them, everybody equally can jump into that starting today. You can start picking up a book and start reading, even if you never read before. Or if you don't want to read or that's not your thing, you can listen to a podcast or what have you. We can all start saying no. There's nothing that stops us from doing that other than ourselves. And we can all discover our purpose. So what I love is I think people want the things that they can have that nobody else can have. But the coolest thing is the top traits of the highest influencers, we can all start practicing them tomorrow. So those are the top three.
It's almost like you've rehearsed that a couple of times. That was unbelievable. So just to kind of dive in and simplify a few of these things, number 3, starting from the top, is kind of protect your time, essentially, right? Especially as you get
Absolutely.
bigger, you really need to hone in on what is going to move the needle for you, and even maybe put a gatekeeper in place so that you don't have to respond to emails and DMs and stuff all day. Things that are going to take your time that should be spent on your purpose and your passion. That's something that I've implemented recently with my executive assistant and automation and things like that. And it's funny how it becomes more and more important and more relevant the bigger that you get, the more successful that you get. So definitely something for people to focus on and think about if you're spending a lot of time on your emails and things that can be outsourced. There's a lot of people asking you to do things, and you're a hard no. It's hard for me to say no to things too. It's really easy for my assistants to say no to things on my behalf.
Absolutely.
So definitely a great one. Number 2, lifelong learning. Absolutely. And it's easier than ever now, right? I mean, there's personal development podcasts, audiobooks, YouTube. Masterclass is something I subscribe to that I use. It's really cool. Instructors on various subjects, but you always have to be
TEDx.
learning and growing.
Blue Talks, TEDx, there's those as well.
TEDx, there you go. It's never been easier and cheaper to go get knowledge that's going to make you a better human. So couldn't agree more. And then I feel like the first one, number 1, highly true, but difficult for people to grasp and to figure out what that thing is. What is your purpose? What do you put on this earth to do that's going to get you hyped up and motivated enough to, dedicate your life to it and get up every morning excited? I mean, what is your opinion there? I mean, do you think that is something attainable by everybody, and are there steps to actually do it? Because, 2 and 3, I can do. I can teach someone how to do that. Number 1, I don't think I can.
So I'm going to give you a quick answer to this, but I hope it's powerful for the listener as well, because I've actually wrote a book called The Book of Why and How. So this is something that's near and dear to my heart. And by the way, it's kind of, I didn't plan it this way, but it's kind of a full circle, because when I talked about that stand-up performance, I believe that's what started it for me. Because when I went into the office the next day, somebody said, "Dude, did you meet a girl or something? Because you got to jump in your step." But it was actually that I had done the stand-up thing that was outside my comfort zone. And so what happened was that was a test, or that was a tip to me that you're onto something. Now, like I said, I think your passion is what you do. So comedy could be the passion, or photography, or Facebook ads, whatever it is, the thing that I think is the passion. The purpose is why you're doing it. Now, here's what I've discovered over time. The passion can change 100 times. The purpose rarely changes, meaning what you're doing can change, but why you're actually doing it usually stays the same or pretty constant. So, but what's good about that, and here's one of the tricks, is I found that almost everybody has to discover the what first, and then eventually from doing the what, they discover the why. So I think the what is the gateway drug to finding the why. And so what I mean by that, for example, stand-up. Stand-up wasn't my purpose. It wasn't my why. I left it in the dust long ago, and it didn't bother me at all, and I'm still serving a similar purpose. Then I went on to speaking. Speaking was my what, or my passion. Well, in more recent years, now it's helping other people get on stages. It's the next level. But guess what? That's a different what. That's a different passion. So that's three different passions or what's, whatever you want to call it. But my why never changed all the way through that. My why was to try to create a positive ripple for other people. And now I can actually have a better metaphor for it, because I said I used to be the surfer. As the comic, as the speaker, I was the surfer on the wave going, hey guys, look at me, I'm surfing. Because you're up there with a mic, it's just you. Now I'm trying to create waves for 200 other surfers and help them get up on the board and surf. And so that's my that's my sort of calling, if you will. But so that's, first of all, the big tip, and it sounds like a small thing, but I don't want people to gloss that over, is your what is usually the gateway to your why. Now, what I'm going to say, so here is the steps I take people through, and I'll tell you this in try to tell you this in 1 minute, but I think it's powerful. And hopefully people get the idea of the exercise. So basically the exercise is that you essentially make a list. And people have heard this before. What would you do if you won the lottery? Well, what I've discovered is a lot of people say they would go to the beach and never work again. Well, my question is, okay, once you realize that's not going to satisfy you for most people, what would you do when you came back from the beach? Because that's what we're really talking about. So most people think that's what they would do, and they would get bored and wouldn't have a purpose anymore. So what I'm trying to figure out is, what's the thing that people say you're really good at, and it comes effortlessly? What's the thing, and I'm asking people to write this list. So what's the thing that when you were younger and you were a kid, you loved doing? What's the thing whenever you wanted to do it, people talked you out of it? What was the thing in there? So for example, you want to go to clown college and they talked you into practicality to go to business college. Well, what did you like about clown college? Let's go back to that. What's the thing, again, you would do if money wasn't an issue? What's the thing you do when you don't watch the clock? So what I want people to do is write down, okay, and I'm just randomly picking them, but photography, playing guitar, whatever that is to them, running a business, can be all those things. Make a list. So now you get a list of, say, 10 things for some people. Now what I want you to do is say, what's the one that I can't live without? So I want you to basically put them in priority order. So that the one that you could drop tomorrow if you absolutely had to, put that at the bottom of the list. The one that you don't think you could drop, put at the top. And the one that you don't think you could drop might not even be something you're currently doing. It's just something you're really passionate about. So what I'm trying to do with that is, I'm all about efficiency. So I want you to put the one at the top of the list, which is more likely to be your passion. And so next, after this, what I want you to do is go, okay, I have a list of 10, let's say. Now I have them in the right order. The first one on the top of the list, let's just randomly pick. Let's say it's photography. Then what I want you to do is say, what are the 5 things or 3 things I would have to do to eventually charge for photography? Let's say that's what you want it to do. You might not want to charge, but let's say that's what it is. Or what's the thing I would have to do to eventually film musicians? And break that down. And so you might have 5 steps. Now they're baby steps. It's easier to do those than it is to just jump right in. One could be taking a photography course. One could be sitting with a photographer and saying, what are the things I need to know? And so I want you to set those in advance, and every one of those you achieve, you give yourself a reward. Now, this reward's planned. Why is that? Because we're going to chase the carrot a lot longer if we have the reward of the carrot. And so for every one of these you achieve, you give yourself the reward. And these are the smaller ones, so it's easier to achieve them. By the time you get to the 5th one, the biggest one, now you've planned already, again, a bigger reward for the biggest one. But what you're going to find is going to be so easier to take that last step. And this can be even as something as crazy as comedy, but it's easier to take that last step once you've taken the smaller steps and you've gotten all these rewards and you've gotten the confidence of taking those smaller steps. But now, why are we doing all this? It's because when you go through all those steps, my goal is, by the time you're done, which could take you 3 months, by the way, of that first one on your list, you're going to know inside and out whether or not it's still your passion. Right. If you hate it by the time, by the way, I would encourage you, if you hate it by the second step, quit. What I saw this the other day, and I agree with it. Leaders sometimes are quitters. You should quit that thing. If you don't like it, and it's now you're like, man, wouldn't want to do this ever. And I thought I would love it. Then quit it and go to the second one on the list. What's going to happen is, I think you're going to figure out by the time you get to that last step if it's really on your list. And people will say to me, well, I'm wasting all this time to find it out. It took 3 months. You know that most people go their whole life without ever finding their passion. So if you can find it in 3 months, doing something, by the way, that you think you love anyway, is that really that bad of a 3 month spent? And you're getting adventure and life experience. You're becoming a more well-rounded person. So what I would say, Jay, as far as practical steps, put the list together, prioritize them, figure out what the small steps are for each thing on that list, reward yourself as you achieve them. And I think you'll find by the time you get to the last step, you'll know if it's a passion. And then just keep doing it because you love it anyway. And then what I think you'll find is the purpose will reveal itself to your surprise.
Great advice. I'm definitely going to pick up that book because I think that's going to be really helpful for a lot of people to find their purpose and passion. Isn't it funny how little effort and care people put into things that make the biggest impact in their life long term? Figuring out what your passion is and figuring out how to do it. I mean, that's something you turn that lever the right way and your life is going to be totally different. Same thing with relationships. People just like hop on Tinder, go on a couple dates, end up marrying that person and wonder why they're unhappy. I mean, that's a totally separate conversation. But man, there's so many,
Absolutely.
there's a few levers out there that you can turn just if you put a little bit more care and time into it, that your life is going to be so exponentially different. So I am glad that we went that direction with purpose and passion because it's so important. It's one of those levers where if that monologue that that they just heard hits a chord with somebody, I mean that can change their entire life. And I agree with you. I think everybody's got something they were put on this earth to do. Some people have to work a little bit harder to dig it out and uncover it, but it's worth the dig. It's something that you should put the time and effort to go find your purpose, figure out what that is. All right, Corey, obviously you've interviewed 7,000 experts. You've written books. You've done TED Talks. You've been on thousands of stages or gave thousands of talks yourself. Tell me, in your experience, name one leader, one mentor that you followed that's really inspired you throughout your journey.
So now let me, can I ask a question on the question
Yes, absolutely.
because it'll might maybe change my answer, but is this somebody now in your mind when you're thinking of this question, is it somebody that I've met and worked with, or is it somebody from afar that I've never met, or like, 'cause I view that different ways. So I'm
Absolutely. So it
curious your
can
thoughts.
be anybody. So particularly, like for me, it's going to be virtual. People that I consume. Tony Robbins was a big one for me. It's one name that you've mentioned before. I
Yeah,
I have seen him talk live. He's a force to be reckoned with. I've never seen anything quite like it. But everything he
absolutely.
says just really resonates with people, not just me, but with everyone. So who's that person for you that may have inspired your journey and helped you get through it?
So it's interesting because it'd be easy for me to say my grandfather was the biggest influence on my life, but I want to give you a name and a
Yes.
circumstance maybe a little deeper than that. But I mean
And
that would be, I can honestly say he was one of the biggest influences in my life and influencers. Having said that, this is where it gets tough because if we're talking from afar that I've never met, I probably have to say I think I'm almost obligated to say Napoleon Hill because Think and Grow Rich was my first book I ever read in my life was age 27. So when I talk about you can learn to read at any age, I know that from experience. First book I ever read was How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. So you would think Dale Carnegie would be the most influential person, but the second book I ever read was Think and Grow Rich. And those two books together, I said, if you're going to start late, that's a good place to start because it puts me ahead of a lot of the people that never read those books.
it's a
But
tough
Napoleon
read for
Hill,
your first book.
yeah, both of them were
Good
pretty
for you.
tough. Well,
Yeah.
the the Carnegie one, I think, to be honest with you, if I would have started with Think and Grow Rich, I might not be talking. I might not even be here with you right now because it might not have started that path. One thing that Dale Carnegie had that most didn't is he has such a storytelling, masterful style of writing that and easy to consume, and also like he knew, like for example, his first. I can still tell you to this day what the first story is in his book, and it's about this guy named Two Gun Crowley who shot cops and killed all these people, but he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. So from his perspective, he's like, "Why is everybody always picking on me?" And Carnegie was talking about how to the person themselves, they don't think there's anything wrong with what they're doing. And but my point is that story was what did it because I read multiple books. I read like a chapter early on life, and I'm like, this sucks. I don't like reading. And whatever that story pulled me in because it was about this. I loved reading or watching westerns, so that pulled me in. And then I just kept going. I couldn't put the book down. I read it twice the same weekend. So technically, that was my first and second book. But second real book was Think and Grow Rich. But what the difference with Napoleon Hill was, he was like me. So his background, he was a publisher before he wrote the book. I was a publisher before I got into the book thing. He's raised by a single mother, and on and on. But he became obsessed with interviewing people. I became obsessed with interviewing people. So I think if I look at my career in life, I have to go to Napoleon Hill because all the things he did influenced probably in a lot of ways what I became passionate about doing and what I'm still doing to this day. So I have to probably say Napoleon Hill.
I agree with you. He's been an influence on my career and business as well and my personal life, and great choice. Corey,
Thank you.
where's the best place for people to connect with you if they liked what they heard, want to follow your journey, and get in touch?
If it's cool, what I'll do is I'll give people a gift, um, and
Please.
if that is cool to do that, I'll give them a copy of my book called The Book of Public Speaking. And it's actually, the name is being changed right now, but the website still has that, so it's easy to use that name. It's actually getting changed to Get Paid to Speak, because that's really what the book is more about. But still, right now, it's up for free for people to grab it at thebookofpublicspeaking.com. I like to keep things easy, so thebookofpublicspeaking.com. People grab the free book there if they want, and even when we change the name, it'll still redirect from that site, because I know podcasts are evergreen, so it'll stay up.
Right.
And actually, I'll go one step further. I know we should only ever give one, because people, if you give them two, sometimes freeze. But since you mentioned the Book of Why, and that you wanted to grab a copy, and also somebody might want to hear more about that exercise I mentioned, I'll give a second one, which I don't usually do, which is if you go to the bookofwhyaudio.com. So the bookofwhyaudio.com, that's the shortcut to grab the free audiobook as well for that book. So one book is the digital print book, or a digital PDF that you'll get, is the Book of Public Speaking. The other one, if you like audiobooks and you're not a reader and you know you're not going to read that first one, go to the book of whyaudio.com and grab the free audiobook.
I've got the links. You know me so well with the audiobook. Thank you for doing that for me. Thank you for doing that for my audience. And you heard them. Go check out those book sites. They'll be linked down in the show notes. Go follow Corey on LinkedIn. And Corey, I want to thank you for taking some time with me to talk about leadership, talk about speaking, talk about some really awesome things, including, finding your mission, finding your purpose, finding your why. And I know that this episode touched a lot of the listeners. So thank you for your time. This was a blast.
Thanks, Jay. It's been an absolute pleasure.